Okay. There it is. You are live. It's so excited to tell us that, right? It puts it up on the screen. It says, you are live. I just
wake up, pay attention. Yeah.
It's a big thrill. Calling Chris Anderson in Windsor. You're back.
I am, shockingly. Yes, I am home in Windsor. Yep, Studio W1. And you are in Chicago.
I am in Chicago. Happy to be here here this week and next week. Well, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show and for letting Chris and I do it from our homes for a couple of weeks. Yeah. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, listening on the HHH
podcast.
Yes, we're glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about Winston Churchill and D-Day. I'm sure we'll have a good sized audience for that. Let us know where you are, what you're drinking. And I know a lot of people want to let us know with the weather. I feel sometimes that we have a whole weather report aspect to the
that's kind of an
audience in this show. Yeah. And Chris, we should thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. And I'll remind you that you can join this august group by clicking on patreon.com/historyhappyhour. And so, Chris, how long are you in Windsor for before you're on the road again?
I'm going to be home for 2 weeks. I think it's about 2 weeks. And then I go to Lisbon for 4 or 5 days to spend with Anna to celebrate our anniversary. And then going on a cruise where I think I'm going to speak a little bit about Frederick Morgan and some other folks. And I'm going to run into you, I think, right?
Fantastic. Yes, I will be there. And I think I'll be speaking about, I'm sure you'll be there to watch me speak about. Yes.
I thought you were going to stop talking about that.
I will stop now. So who's out there watching, Chris? Who's in our audience today?
Well, Heather B's joining us from Northern Colorado, Tony Coulter from Brandywine, PA, David Lagrave from Buffalo, New York. And who else do you see there? Jack Sadler is here.
I was just in Brandywine, PA.
Yeah.
There was a big battle there.
I heard.
Yeah.
Who won?
Your team did. Yeah.
Yeah, see? There you go.
It was okay. Okay. So thanks a lot.
Moving on. That's a little softball.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, so are we ready to go? Should we
I
give
think
this a
so.
shot? All right. Give me a cue and I'll play the open and if I can find it here and we'll get started.
Oh, there you go. The bar is open. The bell was a little flaccid this week, Rick, but I think...
I'm not sure what you want out of the bell.
There we go. I want
right. Maybe I hit it too hard.
There you go. Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
What's on tap, Chris?
Well, yeah, I'm super excited about this week's show. We are joined this week by General Sir Richard Dannatt, as the former Chief of the General Staff and a veteran of 40 years of military service. He led the British Army in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2009, Her Majesty the Queen appointed him Constable of the Tower of London, and in 2010, he was appointed as crossbencher in the House of Lords. And he's chairman of the trustees of the British Normandy Memorial. And if that wasn't enough, he's joined by his co-author, Allen Packwood, who is a fellow of Churchill College, Cambridge, the director of the Churchill Archives Center, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He was awarded an OBE for services to archives and scholarship in 2016. His book, How Churchill Waged War, was published in 2018, and he has since edited the Cambridge Companion to Winston Churchill and co-edited Letters for the Ages, the private and personal letters of Sir Winston Churchill. And if I kept going on, we would be talking about their credentials all show, but I'll cut it off there and say that we're here to talk about their new book, Churchill's D-Day, the British Bulldog's Faithful Hours During the Normandy Invasion. Do you like that?
Yeah. Richard and Alan, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thanks so much for joining us, guys.
Good afternoon. Great to join you.
Great to be here.
Probably our most distinguished guest grouping.
I would say so. Yes.
But, we'll see if we get further than that. And do either of you have a cocktail? I know, Alan, you have somebody there who drank cocktails with you, but
I do. I thought I'd bring Churchill into the conversation because I'm in the office. I haven't got a cocktail, so I'm having to pretend that this is gin or vodka. But Churchill would be scowling at me. He said you could never make a good speech on iced water.
See,
Richard, what have you got there?
Well, I've got a whiskey and soda because in the UK it's 9 o'clock in the evening, and that's what chaps like me need. But of course, in the fridge downstairs, I got a vintage bottle of Pol Roger, which of course is Winston Churchill's favourite champagne tipple, and I think it probably was the key to the success of United Kingdom, Great Britain, and her allies winning the war in 1945.
so
But
all the questions have been answered now.
we'll probably come back to one or two other reasons relating to that in the course of the next half an hour or so.
Well,
There were one or two other reasons.
okay, good. Rick, you?
All right, Chris, you can. Oh, I have. Sorry, I have a beer. I have a beer in my PSYOP glass here. And how about you, Chris?
My Glen Turret 12.
Nice, excellent.
All right.
Why don't you start us off?
So I did a really bit of a deep dive and statistical analysis here before the show. I typed in Amazon and I typed in D-Day and I got a list of 3,000 book titles with a plus sign after it. And then I did the same for Churchill and I got 6,000. So you guys are stepping into some well-trodden water. So what I guess what I'd like to start with is, what was the gap? What did you think needed to be said about either Churchill or D-Day or both, or what drove you to this?
Well, I think your introduction almost answers the question. There are lots of books about Churchill. There are lots of books about D-Day. But what Alan and I have endeavored to do is to focus in on Winston Churchill's role on D-Day. Now, of course, Winston Churchill is hugely famous, but he's particularly famous in the context of the Second World War for 1940, the beginning of the war, when Britain stood alone. We will never surrender. All those fantastic speeches that he made. And that was absolutely critical to make sure that Germany did not dominate Europe, but Britain stood alone. And eventually our other allies, Soviet Union, United States of America, came into the war, and we all know the history of the war. But that moment when Winston Churchill stood alone was fundamental. So what we've tried to do is to say, yes, of course, we all know about Winston Churchill in 1940, but this is about Winston Churchill and his role as we move towards 1944 and D-Day and the Allied armies, United Kingdom, Canada, and particularly the United States, moving back into Western Europe and eventually driving across Western Europe, meeting up with the Red Army coming the other way, and eventually destroying Nazism, fascism, and bringing freedom back to Europe. So Churchill and D-Day, probably an untold story, and we've tried to give it a good airing.
What do I think?
And if I can come in and just
please do.
I mean, I agree with everything that Richard said, but I like to present this in film terms. When you think of D-Day, I think people tend to think of the film Saving Private Ryan, and the predominant image is American GIs storming the beaches. And Churchill is largely out of the picture, yet this was a moment that he'd worked for 4 long, hard years. And more than that, when Churchill is portrayed in relation to D-Day, it's often been very negatively. There is the film Churchill that came out, I think, in 2017 with Brian Cox as Winston Churchill. And that film opens with the British Prime Minister sort of pacing a beach, looking out across the channel as in his mind's eye the waves run red with blood, and has him sort of fearing a recurrence of Gallipoli, and then doing everything he can with only 48 hours to go to actually obstruct the military operation, and then taking to his bed as a sort of gibbering wreck when no one will listen to him. And obviously that is not the historical truth of this. And so what we wanted to do, I think, was to go back and look at the role Churchill did play in facilitating D-Day, both in terms of the sort of grand strategy, which I'm sure we'll come in to talk about, and then the actual preparations and run up themselves.
But as Alan said, there is no doubt that Winston Churchill, having been First Lord of the Admiralty and been the architect of the failed Gallipoli campaign in 1915, 1916, and then again First Lord of the Admiralty in early 1940, and the architect of the Norwegian campaign, which was also a disaster, these things weighed very heavily on his mind. So he wanted to absolutely make sure that if there was going to be a second front launch from Great Britain into France, that it was going to be successful and it wouldn't be the bloodbath that he feared. And of course, that's what the book tries to set out to say, what his role was in ensuring that eventually, ultimately, it was a success, which of course it was. History records that.
We're going to get into the topic of Churchill and D-Day, but you open and close the book with Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis, who was the only soldier awarded a Victoria Cross for his actions on D-Day, also someone with an amazing World War II combat record that started 4 years before that. Richard, you started your military career in the Green Howards, the unit he served in during the war, so I'm guessing this might have been your idea, but I'm curious, why frame this book with Stanley Hollis?
Well, I'll come back to Stan Hollis, but perhaps I'll just answer the question rather more widely. I hadn't met Alan until his predecessor, the original keeper of the Churchill Archives, the well-known historian Corelli Barnett, died, and he had a memorial event, and his family, and I'm a close neighbour of Bill Barnett's, Corelli Barnett's, asked me if I would give one of the eulogies at his memorial. And I duly did that at Churchill College, Cambridge, and it was a great privilege to do that. And as Alan was walking me back to my car, he said, I think we've got a common interest in D-Day, a common interest in Churchill. What about us writing a book to come out in time for the 80th anniversary of D-Day about Churchill's role in D-Day? And of course, that's what I immediately agreed to do. And of course, one of the reasons why I agreed is because Company Sergeant Major Stan Hollis of D Company 6th Battalion Green Howards won the only Victoria Cross that was awarded to British Armed Forces on D-Day itself. And he was a member of my regiment, and his deeds, not just on D-Day, but going right back to Dunkirk, when he was instrumental in Dunkirk, and then fought with the regiment right through North Africa and into Sicily, and then storming across the beaches, and won the only Victoria Cross on D-Day. So I had a huge personal connection with not just Churchill, Churchill College, D-Day, but Stan Hollis, the Green Howards. So it all came together as far as I was concerned. And I said to Alan, yeah, we got to do this. Let's get it done and get it published by the 6th of June, 2024.
But I think it was also really powerful to start with an individual storming the beaches, and to give you that sort of that individual perspective. Throughout the book, what we try and do is to interlace the grand strategy and the contents of Churchill's dispatch box, what he was seeing and doing, with how that was impacting the lives of so many different individuals. So we tell the stories throughout the books of people who were involved as civilians in the planning, but also people who are involved in the military, in the Navy, in the air. And I think the idea behind that really was to emphasize that these decisions that are being taken by Churchill and Roosevelt and Eisenhower and others are having an impact on a huge range of individuals, on a huge range of different lives, but also that D-Day was an incredibly complex operation that could not have happened without the input of this huge range of people. So it's about showing the relationship between what's going on at the center and how that's actually being delivered in practice by a huge range of people.
And Alan's absolutely right there. And of course, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, was the launch pad for Operation Overlord. But to be the launch pad, so many things had to happen. And Winston Churchill, as the Prime Minister, had to make sure that they happened. that British industry was behind all the things that had to be done, the construction of the Mulberry harbours, and so much more. So his role, though understated hitherto until we publish this book, is actually critical, and we've tried to give him the due profile that he should have for his role in making Overlord successful, which of course was the prelude to the end of the Second World War. And we've just all been commemorating VE Day 80 on the 8th of May this year, when the chapter in Europe closed victoriously, but it wouldn't have opened unless D-Day had been successful. And that was not a given. There were a lot of concerns, a lot of worries. Everybody was very nervous about it. They could control most things. The one thing they couldn't control is the weather. And as we know, and perhaps we can talk about it later, the weather played a major role and it involved delay by 24 hours. So it's we can't take too much away from what Churchill did.
And it's interesting to me that, as you point out in the book, he doesn't really appear front and center in a lot of the usual narratives of the war. I think you said something about, we talk about him in Mulberry and that's about it. But he is central. And I think one of the things that would be helpful, particularly to some of our American viewers, is if you could explain a little bit about how the senior command structure works in Great Britain, because it's not, as it is in the United States, where you have President Eisenhower, but he kind of defers to Marshall, and those things go off and happen. And it's much more, I guess, standoff, if that's the right way to say it. But Churchill's much more central to the whole command structure of the British war effort. So I think maybe that would be helpful if our viewers understood that.
I'll let Alan describe the top structure from a political point of view, and then I'll just talk a little bit about the military structure.
Okay.
Over to Alan.
Okay, so of course Churchill is Prime Minister, and as Prime Minister, he is chairing his War Cabinet, which is the supreme civilian authority for the direction of the war. A number of civilian ministers. But Churchill, the lesson that Churchill had taken, I think, from the First World War, and particularly from his experiences around Gallipoli, is that if you were going to wage war on this scale, then you needed actually to bring together the civilian and the military apparatus in the center. You needed to have coordinated overall command. So what Churchill does when he becomes Prime Minister is to make himself not just Prime Minister, but also Minister of Defense. And he creates this new position to do that. And effectively, what that means is that the military chiefs of staff are then reporting to him directly as chair of the Defence Operations Committee, rather than going through the relevant civilian ministers. So he is effectively bypassing and demoting the First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian minister in charge of the Navy, the Secretary of State for War, and the Secretary of State for Air. And he's playing a sort of direct role in managing the wartime operation. So what he's doing effectively is to create a much stronger central apparatus in Downing Street for the running of the war, where he brings together the key civilian ministers with the chiefs of staff and also with his own experts. So he creates within Downing Street a statistical unit to supply him with information so that he can challenge the information that he's being given by others and those from the military and from the departments. So he's trying to create this sort of enhanced unified structure within Downing Street for the central direction of the war. And he's putting himself right at the heart of operations. Of course, when the Americans then come into the war, that necessitates a change in that relationship. And that's something that perhaps Richard can talk a little bit more about. And it means actually that by the time you get to D-Day, Churchill is no longer as hands-on as he would want to be, and I think you can sense his frustration in the months immediately before D-Day, that actually some of the more of the decisions are now being taken in Washington DC. But to understand that, you probably need to know a little bit about the Combined Chiefs of Staff organization. So I'll pass back to Richard.
Well, no, Alan, you're absolutely right, and of course, fundamental to that were the high-level conferences that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, and of course Marshal Stalin had together. Because once the Germans had decided to attack the Soviet Union, and once the Japanese had attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, that actually brought the Soviet Union and the United States into the war. So there were many more interested parties than there were in 1940, when Winston Churchill allegorically could stand on the white cliffs of Dover and be defiant. So one of Churchill's major achievements was to bring those three big leaders together, and particularly as far as President Roosevelt was concerned, was to get agreement that the defeat of Germany was first, rather than the defeat of Japan, which from the United States point of view, given that the United States had been attacked by the Japanese fleet at Pearl Harbor, you could imagine that the United States would have wanted to go after the Japanese first. But Churchill's great strategic coup was to get an agreement that the defeat of Germany came first. And therefore that led to a series of conferences and discussions at the strategic level and at the military strategic level. That's the senior military getting together to work out the military campaign as to how that was going to happen. And of course, from a European perspective, that's what first brought American troops into Europe in Operation Torch, coming into North Africa to help complete the liberation of North Africa, and then through Sicily and into Italy. But of course, this then led to a rising frustration from Churchill's point of view, because yes, the great Joint Chiefs of Staff organization that had been set up produced a planning staff that were going to be working towards what became Operation Overlord. And this was very much a military matter, American, British, and other staffs working together. And there's a sense of frustration, really, that Churchill couldn't be quite as involved as he would like to have been involved, which was why, and we write about this in the book, that as we got quite close to D-Day, he decided to get as close to the action as he could by saying, I'm going to be in my private train. I'm going to get as close to Eisenhower's headquarters as I could in southern England, so I can visit the troops, I can visit Eisenhower, I can talk to Montgomery. But in a sense, he was only influencing, he was only talking. He did not have the control that he had in 1940. So it was a very interesting transition that Winston Churchill had to go from being totally in control to being part of a multinational strategic conversation and a multinational military strategic conversation as the operational planning for what became the largest amphibious operation the world has ever seen and probably will ever see. I mean, I'm tempting fortune and fate here.
Knock on wood.
Knock on wood.
Like
I mean,
that.
I've got a couple of quotes that your listeners might like from
Sure.
Churchill that sort of tie in with this. And on the importance of the American relationship, he told his private secretary, Jock Colville, "No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt." And of the alliance with the Soviet Union, which Richard's referred to, he said that if Hitler had invaded hell, he would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. But this is all relates to the sort of overarching quote that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And we spend a lot of time in the book talking about the development of the strategy for Overlord, particularly between Roosevelt and Churchill, Marshall, Eisenhower, and Brooke, and so on, and you know how that strategy is developed, and why it takes so long, and why there are so many preconditions that have to be met before you can go into Normandy. So why it takes until June 44.
Well, let's dive.
Well, Just on that same
Oh,
theme,
sure, go ahead.
later on at the Tehran conference, Churchill was sat between Marshal Stalin and President Roosevelt, and he said, I'm sat between the Russian bear and the American buffalo, and I'm the little donkey, but I'm the only one who knows the way home. He had supreme confidence that although he'd recognized by that stage of the war the United Kingdom was the junior partner, he reckoned his strategic brilliance was actually the direction that needed to take it through to success. But sorry, I interrupted your question.
No, I was going to follow up on what Alan was talking about. So in April of 1942, George Marshall and Harry Hopkins and others come over from the U.S. to Britain to meet with Churchill and the British Military Command. And this is the subject. You sent us this letter, Alan, from the archives. This is a letter from the president to Winston Churchill saying, you know, whatever Harry and George are going to be here to talk to you about, it's close to my heart. And what they're there to talk about is an invasion, that George Marshall wants to have a cross-channel attack in 1942. And Winston Churchill says, what a good idea, but he's basically seriously opposed to this, and he eventually convinces them to instead invade North Africa. And so he starts out being opposed to a cross-channel invasion, and I think that sort of sticks with him in the story, that people think of Churchill as being opposed to this. Your argument in the book, and I'm quoting you here, is that Churchill played a key role in the timing and nature of Overlord. So, okay, what are his most important decisions or actions that impact Overlord and support that statement?
Okay.
And nobody wants to answer. No,
I'm very happy to go in here, because I think Churchill does an incredible amount that hasn't been recognised. I think the first key decision that Churchill takes is the right one, that 1942 is not the right time to be trying a return to France and operations in France. So, I mean, it's quite clear that the Americans are advocating operations in France, but they're equally clear that it's going to take at least a year until April 1943 to build up sufficient US forces in the UK to actually contemplate large-scale landings. And that means effectively that you've got a year where either the British are going to have to bear the burden of operations in France on their own, or you're going to sit and do nothing in the UK while assembling the required forces, while Stalin and the Red Army bears the brunt of the German offensive on the Eastern Front, which was clearly politically and militarily unacceptable to both Churchill and Roosevelt. So I think Churchill is right first of all, to steer the Americans away from operations in France to North Africa. You know, the British are already incredibly overstretched in 1942. We've just lost Singapore and Hong Kong. We're struggling against Rommel in North Africa. This is a chance actually to develop the close partnership with the United States and the teamwork that is going to be necessary for Overlord, but to develop it against a much less fortified coastline. So I think actually it is a key moment steering into North Africa. It's born of British weakness, but it's still vital for the overall success of the war. And then I think he's also right in identifying a number of other preconditions that have to be met before you can go into Normandy. You know, the Normandy coastline is incredibly well defended in 42, 43. Before you go up against that, you're going to want to make sure that you have control of the Atlantic, so that you can actually get your troops and materials across the Atlantic into the UK. You're going to want to make sure you've got mastery of the skies over Europe. You're going to want to have worn your enemy down. You're going to want to develop the equipment and the tactics and the deception plans that are actually going to guarantee the success of what is a pivotal operation. And all of that takes time. And this is a point that I think that we're very keen to emphasize in the book, that the success of D-Day comes out of the coming together of all of these things.
And I think one should also say that the decision, which we all know was taken to come across the beaches in Normandy, turned out to be the right thing to do. But in 1942, there was the Dieppe raid, Operation Jubilee, where a major attempt, largely with the Canadian division, to see if it was possible to capture a port. And of course, a port is really important in terms of getting logistics ashore. And that was a bloody failure. Canadian troops lost many lives, as other countries did as well. But it actually showed that the likelihood of being successful in capturing a working port was very minimal. So that led to the decisions that were taken. Right, we're not going to try and capture working ports. We've got to work out the technical procedures for bringing not just the troops on assaulting waves on D-Day and all the rest of it across the beaches, but how are we going to bring the logistics across the beaches? Because, as we know, ships come into harbors and all the rest of it. And that was the origin of the Mulberry harbors, Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, and all these things. These had to be tried. They had to be worked out, the implications of them, in order to bring a really good plan that had the potential, not the guarantee, but the potential to be successful when Operation Overlord was launched, as indeed it was in early June 1944.
So I was going to pop up a question here. You've touched on this a bit, but Jack Abrams has asked, and I was going to ask something along these lines. He says, might you talk about Churchill's special relationship with President Roosevelt and its impact on D-Day, if any? And I would add to that, I think now in the 80 years since, there's a tendency perhaps to look at this relationship between two of the countries through some rose-colored glasses. And so I'd kind of like your thoughts on, was it a special relationship? What are some of the bonds, but what are some of the tensions? And how is Churchill, playing into that?
Let me let Alan answer the question in the context of the Second World War, and I'll talk about the context now.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, well, in the context of the Second World War, I don't think there's any doubt that on a personal level, a purely personal level, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill got on quite well. Actually, they had quite a lot in common. They both came from sort of quite patrician backgrounds. They shared interests in history. They'd had some sort of common life experiences in terms of the Navy. So I don't doubt that when they were together, they enjoyed one another's company. It is also, of course, famously quite lonely at the top. And I'm not sure that Roosevelt and Churchill had many other people that they could have sort of engaged in sort of really close conversation with. So I think when they met, I think they had a warm personal relationship. In terms of the relationship during the war, I would say that it falls into three distinct phases. And those phases I would describe as courtship, and I've already touched on that a little bit, between 1940 and 41 up till the time of Pearl Harbor. Churchill is desperate to get greater American involvement in the war, and he's doing everything he can in public through his speeches and broadcasts, in private through his telegram and telephone correspondence with Roosevelt, and by entertaining Roosevelt's emissaries, and through their first meeting at the Atlantic meeting off Newfoundland in August 1941. He's doing everything he can to try and cultivate this relationship. Once you have Pearl Harbor, I think you then enter a second phase, which you could describe as marriage or perhaps as a honeymoon period, where actually they're working sort of very closely together to hammer out the military strategy that is going to defeat the Axis powers. And Richard's already talked about the sort of series of grueling conferences that you have between sort of Casablanca and Tehran, where you bring together the military heads from both countries, and you forge this unprecedented alliance in the combined chiefs of staff, which actually sees British commanders, sees British troops serving under American commanders, and vice versa. So that's the sort of honeymoon period, and that builds up to Overlord, I think, and ultimately delivers Overlord. The final phase of the war I would describe as marital difficulties. And that's, I think, where you start to see things pulling apart as the end of the war comes in sight, as they can see the finishing post, because Roosevelt and Churchill have very different visions for the post-war world. Churchill is fighting for a return to the world of 1939 and the British imperial position in the Mediterranean, and is concerned by Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Roosevelt, of course, is increasingly thinking about his new world order, the new United Nations organization. He's also thinking about the war in the Pacific and the need to engage with Stalin and with Russia to win that war. So I think you start to see tensions sort of emerging in the relationship, which pull them apart in that latter period from D-Day to Roosevelt's death in April 1945.
Okay. I think Alan has put it extraordinarily well. In near terms, after the Second World War, of course, there are events that occurred quite shortly after that. President Roosevelt, as we know, did not live very long. But in some of his final conversations with Marshal Stalin, he was very keen, in order to increase the pressure on Japan, that Russia should get involved in operations against the Japanese in Korea. And this is not the subject of this conversation, but it could be argued that 75 years on next month, when the Korean War started, those conversations actually led to a strategic misappreciation, and the last phase of the Second World War, if you like, was fought out, continues to be fought out on the peninsula of Korea. But that's not what we're talking about tonight. Where we are now, as far as the United States, United Kingdom is concerned, is that, yes, of course, historically we've had a very interesting relationship. I mean, I'm not going to tell you all listeners the origin of the United States of America, and so on and so forth. But we have worked together very closely over the years. It is sometimes, perhaps too often, called a special relationship, and I think that's a bit of a presumption. Undoubtedly, today, the special relationship is absolutely a special intelligence relationship. The United States with the United Kingdom shares intelligence on worldwide issues in a very significant way, and we could not operate together. But just going back just 20 years in history, the Iraq campaign, Afghanistan, and the rest of it, the United States still is today the world's largest military superpower. But even the United States knows that to get international support, it needs allies. And the United Kingdom has been a very faithful and intelligent ally of the United States. And I think that's an important thing to continue. Now, of course, the relationship, which has changed hugely over the years that we're talking about, and I actually say that it began to change when Field Marshal Montgomery, who had commanded the land forces from D-Day in the initial phases of the Normandy campaign, when he handed over overall command to General Eisenhower. At that moment, the United States took overall control. And from that moment on, the United States has been the major partner in any relationship with the UK, and the United Kingdom has been the junior partner. And we've seen that, of course, in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And even, I'm dotting around in history now, but go to the Suez conflict in 1956. The British and the French, in conjunction with the Israelis, came up with a cockeyed plan to take back control of the Suez Canal. Well, it wasn't supported by the United States. And when the United States government and the World Bank said, hang on, this is wrong, stop. Well, we had to stop, and we stopped pretty damn quick. So the change in the relationship, the special relationship, has very much been really, I would say, from the latter part of the Normandy campaign through history. The United States has been the major partner. We've been a junior partner. We've been a willing partner. But actually, the cement there is the special relationship of our special intelligence relationship.
Okay, so getting back to 1944, Churchill was a very active lobbyist, if I can use that word, with Allied generals. He frequently meets with General Alan Brooke, who's the chief of the General Staff, General Eisenhower, who's the supreme Allied commander, and is often pushing to get his way. Now, President Roosevelt was much more hands-off, partly because of distance, partly because of style. How effective do you think Churchill is in his lobbying efforts? And I'm going to ask Richard to answer this first, because I'm particularly interested in hearing from you about this, because I know that when you were chief of the General Staff, you must have had to deal with prime ministers, and so you would have a very unique perspective on this.
Well, Churchill and Alan Brooke, as the chief of the Imperial General Staff, had a very interesting relationship. It was quite a volatile relationship. In closed doors, behind closed doors, they would have very frank conversations. At times they would thump the table, they would actually shout at each other. But in all that was a very constructive conversation, because Churchill, who very much thought that he knew the answer to most questions, that he knew the way, had to actually listen to his senior military professional with all his background, who had at times a different point of view. But the upshot of those conversations was a better outcome. And I think that's a very significant plus point of leadership, when you are prepared to have robust discussions with effectively a subordinate, which is what Alan Brooke was, and take on board what he might have said. So I think their relationship was absolutely key, and really significant, even though it wasn't always a very harmonious one. Now, you refer to me. Well, I was chief of the General Staff when we were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. We are a democratic country. The government of the day decides what we're going to do. We were going to get involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. Fine. That's absolutely fine. And the military will do whatever the government of the day wants us to do. But just give us the resources, give us what we need to do the job. And that was really where I fell out with Prime Minister Tony Blair and Prime Minister Gordon Brown. So when it came to the end of my 3 years as Chief of the General Staff, there was no question of me becoming Chief of the Joint Staffs, Chief of the Defence Staff, as we call it. I was sent to the Tower of London. Well, and that's what happened. Who fall out of favour. But the big difference was I had the keys. I had to see the late Queen's appointment to send them to the Tower, not the Prime Minister. But I think the whole point is you've got to respect the politician's view. The politician's got to respect the military view. Put them together, have your discussions behind closed doors, and then you get a good outcome. And that's actually really what characterized Churchill and Alan Brooke, both professionals, both dedicated to the same strategic objective, but together they worked it out.
Alan, did you want to contribute on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, if I can come in, I mean, the obvious Churchill quote that springs to mind from what Richard's just said is, give us the tools and we will finish the job. But in terms of Churchill's role, yes, he certainly sees a major part of his role as being a prod, as he would have seen it. And he certainly didn't hesitate to express his opinions to the generals, to the cabinet, to everyone around him. But I think he does play a couple of overlooked roles here. One is his role in actually bringing people together to solve key problems, using effectively the convening power of the office of Prime Minister. He actually sets up and chairs in early 1944 an Overlord Preparations Committee. And this is meeting not to look at the military questions, which are being decided by Eisenhower and Montgomery and Ramsey and others, but actually to create the infrastructure that will allow Overlord to happen. So he's making sure that the country actually is ready to support an operation of this scale, where you're bringing over 1.6 million US servicemen. I mean, that's not something that's going to happen overnight. You've got to have the railways, the barracks, the depots, the harbours, all of these things in place. And then he identifies key problems. So he convenes a meeting to actually look at the whole question of the assembly of the artificial mulberry harbours, to make sure that actually all the different component parts that are being manufactured in different places are going to be brought together in one place on time when needed. So he's banging heads together. He's banging military and civilian heads together. And the other point that I would make is that, of course, as a politician and as a prime minister, he's having on some occasions to look beyond purely military affairs and the military operations. And I think one of the things that we bring out in the book is that one of his big concerns just before the D-Day operation is actually the bombing of France, which Eisenhower sees as an integral part of the military operation, but which really concerns Churchill. And his concern is essentially a political concern. It's that if we follow through on this policy of bombing the railway marshalling yards, many of those marshalling yards are situated in areas of dense urban population. And you're going to inflict severe casualties on the French civilian population if you bomb them. And if you do that, the short-term result may then be that the French don't rise up in resistance to their Nazi occupiers as hoped when the Allies go in on the 6th of June. But on the longer term, in the longer term, he's worried actually that it may drive France towards communism post-war. And then there may be a reaction against Britain, against the Allies, against the West, and that this may drive France into a communist government. So he's having to think about the political implications of these operations in a way that Eisenhower, Montgomery, and others are not.
So I would kind of pick up on what you just said, Alan. One of the things that you do so well in the book is to talk about these other sort of tensions and pressures that are pulling on Churchill, that I think if you restrict your reading to just D-Day, you think that that's the only thing that's going on in the world. And as you point out, there's an awful lot more going on. But in fact, you have a section of the book you call The Tyranny of Overlord.
Yeah.
What is the tyranny of Overlord?
I think the tyranny of Overlord for Churchill is the risk of the operation becoming all-consuming and dominant, and then drawing resources away from other theatres, which of course it inevitably does. And Churchill is concerned about this. He recognises that Overlord is the keystone arch of Anglo-American cooperation, that it is the most important operation, that it's got to happen. But he is worried, I think, about putting all the eggs in one basket. If Overlord fails, then that's clearly going to have huge implications for the duration of the war and also for the fate of his own administration. So he's worried that if we invest solely in Overlord and it goes wrong, then that could be catastrophic for Allied strategy. He is also he does also want to continue the fight in Italy. I think that's partly because the Italian theatre is under a British commander, and he can be more directly involved in the military operations in Italy. But I think it's also because he is concerned about the Mediterranean and the Balkans in a way that President Roosevelt isn't. And they are actually quite an important area for Britain's post-war imperial position as he sees it. I mean, this is someone who stands up in the House of Commons in 1942 and says that he has not become the first minister of Great Britain to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. So he's continuing to think in those geopolitical terms.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think Churchill is a product of his past, is a product of the late Victorian era, if you like. And for him, I know it's an anathema in the United States, but the British Empire, for Winston Churchill, was really, really important. He was clearly involved, as we discussed, in the First World War and the issues of the Second World War. Britain stood alone, but he was always thinking, not just, of course we will beat Germany, of course we will beat Italy, with America we will defeat Japan, but where is Britain going to be in the world after that? And he was actually thinking ahead, and that's absolutely what a leader of strategic competence should be doing. Forget the headlines for tomorrow, but where are we going to be, not just next week, next month, but next year? And that's where Churchill was, which of course why, when it came to the general election in 1945 and his government was defeated, for him that was a huge personal tragedy. Actually, personally, from his wife's point of view, Clementine's point of view, it probably kept him alive because he was absolutely exhausted. But he'd always been thinking about the future and where was Britain going to be in the future. Well, the world was always going to be different. The world was going to change, and quite properly, Britain decolonized and we gave up imperial possessions in the 1950s and in the 1960s. But Churchill was always thinking about where would Britain's position be, and wherever we are or wherever we might have been, it could only have been actually enabled by that very close relationship with the United States. And I would just say, by way of making sure all your listeners are aware, we, the United Kingdom government, only repaid our final war debts to the United States in 2006. So we do pay our bills. We do pay our debts.
Richard, I'm sorry, Rick, can I pick up on?
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things that really struck me in the book is something as a comment. Richard, you just talked about the election where Churchill is defeated. I'm sure this happens to Rick. Every single tour I lead in Europe, at some point in the conversation, one of my guests will say, "How was Churchill defeated?" They just don't understand it. Yeah. And you make the very interesting point in the book that there are knock-on effects from D-Day that lead to Churchill's defeat, and maybe you could touch on that.
You're right. There are some practical knock-on effects, or knock-on consequences, or historical events. I mean, the V1, V2 attacks on London began again. So it almost began to bring back the Blitz of death and destruction in London in 1940, 1941, which London had largely been freed of during the course of the war. But those are important, but they're instrumental or accidental aspects. I think there was a growing realization amongst the British population that what had happened was terrible. The war was probably going to end, but rather like the promises that were made at the end of the First World War, that we would produce a land fit for heroes, that after the Second World War, the British population wanted something different, wanted something better. And Churchill had been heading a national government, all the political parties having come together. And I think the people wanted change, and the Labour Party under Clement Attlee, not a very high-profile politician, but a key member of Churchill's war cabinet, seemed to represent to the electorate in this country, not the least of which were servicemen still serving abroad, that when they had the chance to vote, they wanted for a better future. They wanted to vote for, the welfare state, which had been set out in something called the Beveridge Report as early as 1942. They wanted a different world. They wanted a better world. So it wasn't a rejection of Churchill. Actually, it was a desire to say, this has been done. but we've got to go forward. We want to go elsewhere. Now, Churchill, not surprisingly, took it as a very personal defeat. As I said, Clementine was delighted because he was exhausted, and it probably would have killed him if he'd carried on as prime minister. Actually, he had 5 or 6 years in opposition when he could write his history of the Second World War, just to make sure we understood his role in the ending of the Second World War. Alan might comment on that. But I think what I was really saying is that the British people wanted change. And funnily enough, in contemporary terms, we had a change of government last year. After 14 years of a particular government, people wanted change. And that's what happens in a democracy. You get a bit fed up with the incumbent government and the people want change, in which case you vote for the other side. And in this case, they voted for Clement Attlee and the Labour Party, not because they all wanted to become socialists, but they just wanted difference. They wanted change. They wanted hope for the future. And they got what they got.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, there's a natural swing in politics, and of course, people forget that there hadn't been a general election in the UK since 1935. So there had been a whole generation that had come up that had not voted. Now, I'm going to cover Churchill's ears while I say this, but the other factor in this is perhaps that Churchill did not fight a particularly good election campaign. I think he was exhausted after everything that he'd been through, including D-Day and everything that we describe in the book. And I think his focus was on the international scene, on the Potsdam Conference, what the argument I would make is that, he'd led a national coalition government. This was a return to party politics. He could still have presented himself as being a figure above the political fray. And he could have made the case for being allowed to sort of finish the job and see the war in the Pacific Theatre through to its conclusion. He doesn't do that. What he does is perhaps typically Churchillian. He launches into a number of sort of vitriolic attacks against the Labour Party, against ministers or against leaders who had just weeks before been ministers in his coalition government. And in one of these broadcasts, the most famous of them, he says that the Labour Party, if it wins, will have no choice but to install ultimately some form of Gestapo in the UK. Now, that was an incendiary thing to say in the summer of 1945. So I think he probably takes his eye off the ball. But after everything he'd been through, I would say he could be forgiven that. And as Richard said, Clementine, his wife, thought it was a blessing in disguise. And he replied to her, "It's certainly effectively disguised to me."
He was the man for the moment in 1940. And through to 1944 and 1945. But actually, it was time for someone else to be the prime minister and the leadership. That's just the way that countries develop. And, we loved having Winston Churchill back as prime minister later in the early 1950s. And as a small boy, I can remember watching his funeral in 1965. And one thought, well, my gosh, this man is the hero. One of the reasons why I was happy to get involved with Alan writing the book, because Winston Churchill was my boyhood hero. He did all the things that I thought as a young man I would like to do, partly why I joined the army, and we all did silly things. But Winston Churchill, amongst the characters in British history, stands up there, right up the top, and as much to do with D-Day as it was to 1940. And elsewhere, and that's really what's been the motivation for Alan and I to write this book. And it's been a great privilege to work with Alan writing it. And Alan's the expert. I'm the military chatter, and we've had fun together.
Well,
I've learned an enormous amount in writing this with Richard. So.
Well, we've learned a lot just talking to you today. So
yeah, and I just want to encourage everybody to pick up the book. I have to say that this is a topic, both Churchill and D-Day, that has a lot of things written about it, but it's so refreshing to have a book that says some new things about these topics, and there's a lot in here that will fascinate you and sort of keep you turning the pages. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at this.
Definitely worth reading. Richard Dannatt and Allen Packwood, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. We so appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's enjoyable.
Thank you.
God bless.
Okay. All right. And Chris,
Yes.
we there's so much we didn't get to discuss.
I know.
with them,
I didn't get to
so-
ask him about Frederick Morgan. I had
I
a
know,
Frederick
and
Morgan.
And I had a question about one of them's a big movie buff, and I know they're still listening. But there are references to. I started making a note: Saving Private Ryan, Darkest Hour, Dad's Army, Mincemeat, Churchill. I think it's Allen. We're going to ask afterwards, but I think it's Allen as the movie buff.
Put it in the newsletter.
Yeah, right. So next week, we're going to continue the topic of D-Day, and we'll talk with Andrew Whitmarsh, who's the author of D-Day Landing Craft, how 4,126 ugly and unorthodox Allied craft made the Normandy landings possible. So I'm sure we'll be diving into all sorts of technical specifications.
Sorry.
And
Does everybody bear with us? We'll try to keep it all.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting that D-Day, 81 years ago, so much has been written about it, and yet there are still, wherever you put your camera, wherever you put your lens, there's still new things to discover about it.
Absolutely.
Guys, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.